Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the end of March colloquium with Dr. Julia Valliant. Glad folks to make it. A few more coming in. We got 7 or up to 10 people online. I'll let Dr. Valliant introduce her talk, but if you don't know her, she's a research scientist here at the Ostrom Workshop. She's been here for a decade now, give or take, and doing a variety of work on food and farming systems with your dissertation work was on grazers, correct? Here in Indiana?
Yeah, livestock management.
Livestock management from Johns Hopkins and a background and your PhD was in environmental health. So we're fortunate to have Dr. Valliant here, and she's one of my great colleagues. And I just want to say one of my favorite things about her as a scientist is the fact that she puts together some of the most dynamite teams to do like practical, applied, yet policy oriented work. As you can see that she'll talk about, she is able to bring these groups of people together and just makes it happen magically. So I really appreciate that about you. And I'll turn it over to you, and we'll have about what the normal 30 to 45-minute talk, and then plenty of time for Q&A and conversation.
Okay.
And we'll try to monitor online.
Okay. Thank you, James. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming to have your lunch here today and settle in and open your mind to absorbing, thinking about farmed land, farmers and farm owners, because we're going to be looking at those dynamics and policies to support them. So to situate us, here is the world we're focusing on together. So you have a farm, and that farm changes hands. And what changes, excuse me, is either who's working that ground or who's making decisions about how the land is worked and what it's raising, or who owns and has rights to the land, or all of the above. So this handoff from one to the next is a dynamic moment that's taking place all the time, everywhere. And it is part of the backdrop of our hopes to transition towards more sustainable food systems. Several problems surround this handoff or transfer or succession or renewal, as the European literature refers to it. And one problem we will explore today is that farmers, and especially up-and-coming farmers, are getting priced out. And this is everywhere, such that 2 of the UN Sustainable Development Goals denote secure and equal access to land. And that's number 1, no poverty, and number 2, zero hunger. So our research is drilling into this handoff between parties. The US Department of Agriculture has been investing in our primary research and engagement or extension with farmers and landowners, service providers, policy advocates, and policymakers. So now is a good time to mention their disclaimer and to give a big round of thanks to the people, many of whom are at IU, who have been a part of this work as we've been growing this research program over several years. And I want to especially lift up Marie, who's in the room, who's our right-hand person on this work. I want to lift up Bernie, who was instrumental in helping us respond to reviewers in a way that they appreciated and liked back when we were seeking funding. And of course, James for being a catalyst and getting it all started. Okay, so let's try this. I brought an audio clip of 2 people talking to one another. It's 2.5 minutes. And the point of it is to help us settle into this space of farm transfer from an owner to somebody else. It's a super emotional turning point, and it's a super expensive turning point. And a few years ago, we did a project with the National Oral History Project StoryCorps to record long conversations between landowners and land seekers who were collaborating with one another to create land access. Okay, so I want to play this. I have to do a couple technical things first, because I just want you to hear.
We've talked about this a lot, about how the what we'd like to really do when we figure out our transition is to start to become part of the community of people that's trying to popularize the kind of transition we're doing, to give this opportunity to more retiring farmers and to young farmers, because you know, when a farmer has no heirs, or when a farmer has heirs that aren't interested in farming, more likely, you know, the most usually happens is there's an auction, and I don't know if the equipment goes afternoon or the other way around usually, but
And I've spent my entire life accumulating and putting together farming parcels.
I don't know if the equipment goes in the morning and the land in the afternoon or the other way around usually, but one thing we all know is that that's no way for a young farmer to get a start.
Yeah, and I've spent my entire life accumulating and putting together farming parcels.
Yeah.
And I feel it would be a tragedy of immense proportions if I had to call an auctioneer and sell it off by parcel, and who would buy it would be someone, who knows who would buy it, but it wouldn't be a combined logical operation anymore. It would be just bits and pieces here and there.
Mm-hmm.
And that would, you know, that would irritate me. But that would be probably the most financially advantageous for me. You know, you sell off a 40 to somebody from the city and they come out and build a nice big house and rent the balance of the land out to you or put it in a set-aside program, you know. But that's not what it's about, you know. I'm not going to starve to death. I'll be just fine.
Yeah.
And I'll never be unemployed. If I can always work if I am physically able to. I've never been unemployed in my entire life. So what you've done, John, is you've come into our farm, and the first year was learn the ropes and find the corners of the real estate, learn how to operate the equipment that was necessary. Then I gave you the plans, gave you the opportunity to do the crop planting, and with a little bit of guidance, you got the next year's crop planned. We went and planted it. Together we worked the soil, we did the planting, we did the cultivating, we did the harvesting. Then we started getting into the food grade stuff, where then we planted more wheat, and we're transitioning now into a grain cleaning facility, which is your idea, and that's going to be your value added business that makes more money on top of the farm, and that's going to be the thing that's going to bring you the cash that's going to allow us to implement this plan.
Okay, thanks everyone for that. I just feel that's a choice excerpt because you can really hear Paul spilling over with the meaning of this moment for him and the plan that they're making to make it work for everybody. Okay, so today what we're going to do is we're going to have 3 sections to the talk. One is a little background around farmland dynamics by looking at some broad trends around ownership, consolidation, conversion in agriculture and towards development, and how these trends are really hard on farmland affordability and access. Then we're going to look at some policy responses to resist the trends. For some, these trends are worrisome enough that everywhere states and nations are inventing and passing and funding policies that all aim to push back on these broad trends to a small extent and to address farmland affordability and access and pursue alternate outcomes for food systems. What they all aim to do is to facilitate and fund access to land or tenure for young, or to use our country's term, beginner farmers. Barriers are universal from local to global, and we're evaluating the United Statesian versions of them. As a side plug, there is a ton of good work around these same dynamics in other parts of the world. And if you're interested in them in the South, I recommend starting with this short, beautiful report written by a career anthropologist in the area. And then I'll wrap us up by exploring a new paper we are developing, which will look into farmers' views of whose access to opportunity in agriculture merits the support of the state. Okay, so let's kick off with one example by looking at Indiana. So here, our agricultural or our working lands cover a large area. Other states are similar. They may have more public land as opposed to private land, and they may have more developed land. On this land, we know that how farmers farm, how farmers work the land is critical to our resilience and the security of our food systems and our local economy. What we are looking at is how land is owned and how it pieces together to form farms and changes over time to who even has access to work it or own it. So the first challenge is changes over time to the size of farms. So this chart from the US Department of Agriculture shows us this by carrying us from 1850 to 2017. Showing us in the blue line that goes up and then down, that a lot of farms closed through the 20th century. As they did, they were folded into neighboring farms that were getting bigger, such that average farm size tripled in this period of time, which is shown in the green line. So the average size of farms nationally went up from about 150 acres on average to 450 acres on average. There are a bunch of drivers to this pattern, like the economics of grain farming, equipment size, policies, subsidies, and all of it is undergirded by financial logic for every party involved. When a farm closes or changes hands to the next generation and is sold, then that land often becomes a piece of a neighboring farm that's getting bigger, or it gets developed. This is what most farm owners are doing, and that act repeated affects rural communities and food systems. And someone who writes about this really beautifully is a past poet laureate of Iowa, Mary Swander, who we brought here several years ago. And in an interview with WFIU, she said, nothing works in isolation with farmland. You think, oh, this is just my farm. It's a little farm. If 120 acres get sucked up into a bigger farm, what difference will that make? Well, it has a real reverberating effect, and it's way bigger than one family. Anybody you talk to in this area has nostalgic stories about what their rural communities used to be like. They used to be better than they are now, and that is something that's driving this conversation, from their views. So for people looking to enter farming, the patterns shown here are tough because farms every day are becoming bigger and more expensive, and this is a barrier to finding opportunities to farm. Related, these changes take away farm jobs. As farms simplify and mechanize and consolidate, jobs go away, and so do people in a rural outmigration. We wrote about this type of trend taking place globally now and into the future in a paper Eduardo led for our Sustainable Food Systems Science Group. 200 million jobs in food production were lost in the past 30 years, and that pace may be accelerating. And there's no rising industrial or manufacturing sector very much to replace these jobs. So the paper makes recommendations for how to diversify agriculture and invest in food jobs and redirect subsidies in ways that are forward-looking to build jobs and an abundance of place. So the first challenge combines farm closure, simplification, consolidation, expansion, and rising barriers to people who want to farm. Okay, the second challenge has to do with rising farmland prices. Something that's taking place is more types of buyers want to invest in agricultural land. Having more interested buyers drives up the price. Farm real estate values have been going up fast. This is one reason why. Rising prices pull the land further out of reach for people who want to farm it. I mean, look at the slope in this century and even just in the past handful of years. You know, as Wall Street has begun to systematically invest in ag land. Ag land is a good investment because as it's appreciating, it also earns annual rental revenue. So I really want to credit the research programs of several scholars and their teams who are doing great work in this area, namely Jessica Shoemaker of Nebraska Law and Loka Ashwood of Kentucky Sociology and Madeline Fairbairn of Santa Cruz Environmental Studies. A related challenge is that land ownership is moving away from the farm and increasingly into the hands of corporations. We know that cropland in our country, most of it, is owned by people who do not farm it. And most of those owners who don't farm have zero farming experience, according to Iowa State. And this pie chart shows one example from an analysis that traced the ownership of the agricultural land in 2 Illinois farm country counties. They found that only 30% of the farmland was owned by someone within the county, which is shown in orange. The other 70% was owned by people further away. So 19% surrounding counties, 24 greater Illinois, 27 out of state, and 1% unknown. So this indicates how land ownership increasingly is accessible to the few rather than to the many, and that's only going to get tougher. The third type of challenge that we will touch on is sometimes called farmland loss, or the conversion of land out of agriculture for development. And looking again at Indiana as an example, our state Department of Agriculture and our research partner, the American Farmland Trust, have been doing good work to chronicle and understand changes to Indiana's farmland. So this info comes from them. The map shows in red land that people converted out of agriculture over 15 years from 2001 to 2016. About 30,000 acres a year at a pace that's been faster than the fastest scenario predicted. It's mostly prime farmland that's leaving agriculture, which is shown in the darkest green. This land is sometimes referred to as irreplaceable because once it's developed, it's unlikely to return to agriculture anytime soon. And then most of the converted land, 61% shown in orange, is going to become low density development or neighborhoods. The rest is urban high density purposes. So this trend is good for the seller and for the developer, but the process also drives up the cost of land above the going rates for agricultural land. So the land becomes unaffordable for farming. So our research group is chronicling the things governments are doing to push back on these trends, and we are assessing the effects of their efforts. Okay, so looking at these trends as a group, the direction they're taking us is away from opportunities for the next generation of farmers. Because typically farm owners who are looking to rent out or sell their farms are going to go with the bidder who's lowest risk and who's offering the most. It's a similar dynamic to housing. Some people are worried about the ways the barriers to beginning farmer entry are rising. So they're launching the policy resistance, which we're going to talk about now, to push back and affect who's farming by incentivizing next generation entry. Farmers' ages gets talked a lot about in the policy creation world. Just in terms of age alone, farmers' most productive decade starts at age 35. But only about 1 in 10 farmers are age 35 or younger. And they are outnumbered 6 to 1 by farmers who are 65 and up. This top-heavy balance is the inverse of what you see happening in most other self-employed industries. A few older people and many younger people. So farming is distinctive in this way. Younger farmers' entry is also beneficial because they're more likely to farm in ways that build resilience and regional and local food systems. But at the same time that younger farmers are underrepresented, there are a lot of them who want to farm or to get into farming or to grow their operations. And beautiful research has been done here and overseas about young people's appetite to farm, where and how they can make it work. So it's not like that's gone away. So what you have is younger farmers who are looking to rent or maybe purchase some land. And those land transactions are taking place mainly between people who are unrelated to one another. So what we see in these two charts from the US Department of Agriculture, the left-hand pie are farmland purchases, and blue shows us that almost half are purchased from a non-relative. Red is inheritance or gift. Green is purchased from a relative, and then purple is acquired at auction. The right-hand pie shows all rented land, of which is almost half of land in the Midwest. And the agreements are 2/3 of the time between unrelated tenants and landlords. So it's really normal for people to be transacting with people who are not in their families, which I think is counter to like a myth or a stereotype about how farming works. For instance, the farmer who raises soybeans and feed corn and popcorn on my mom and dad's farm, 12 miles west of here, he has 25 landlords to constitute the land base for his farming operation. So that's a lot of transaction with non-relatives. So out of all these transactions, what's unlikely is that an owner will choose a younger beginning farmer as their tenant or buyer. The most likely options all lead in the directions of an established farmer getting bigger, a non-farmer landowner, or the land going out of agriculture. So none of the options are likely to lead to a younger beginning farmer. So to help in bringing on the next generation of farmers, states began to introduce land access policy incentive concepts in the early 1980s and began to pass them in 1999. These are the states in green. Those outlined in orange are the biggest participants in similar federal initiative. And today we're mainly talking about states. So in launching a land access policy incentive, or as we call them LAPIs, these are acts of resistance by the state to facilitate farmers' access to land and in some states land ownership. Their budgets are quite modest. As a group, these states have spent about $150 million total in the past decade. And the most a single state has spent in a year has been about $9 million. Our research shows that they are succeeding in reaching mainly young farmers. 81% are 35 or younger. Part of the appeal of a land access policy incentive for a state is that, for one, they stand out in this space because signups are comparatively high at a few thousand per year. That's much higher than related initiatives. And they express an endorsement by the states for beginning farmers, so they reverberate. So even though they're not spending that much money, according to this service provider we interviewed in Nebraska, he said it's a great incentive because there's a big chunk of money involved. The LAPIs that lend money directly to beginning farmers, people can get a $300,000 loan at 0%. Those that instead circuit the money to the landowner as the gatekeeper, that landowner can get a $50,000 credit on their taxes every year. So anyway, big chunk of money. Two, it really sends a message to landowners that this is something the state encourages. Three, it sends a message to beginners that they're valued by the state and encouraged to get into farming. And the publicity end of that is at least as important as the cash that changes hands. The LAPIs also tap into landowners' preferences to help the next generation get started. One of our papers found that like 97% of landowners want to do something to help the next generation, but a lot gets in the way of that. And you hear that in this landowners saying, for us, it's important to give a beginning farmer a chance and not just make a big farmer bigger. It's really a joy to help someone get started. Okay, this is the question for the people who really know the literature of the workshop. It's about values. We put out a paper last fall about the values that seem to be driving state legislatures and advocates to form and pass these policies. Because they, so across states, we interviewed, 80 people who had created policies in their respective states. And here they had a ton of agreement around these values. So the values emerge as something held in common and is almost a common pool resource. And some of those values are access to opportunity. Farmers should have a shot. People who want to farm should get to. We want rural communities to prosper and have people of all ages in them. And we want to make up a democratic fabric of landholders, which is our ideal and is different than what we have. So this is a question I have for you all as people who really know the literature and the cultural commons literature. So what work would you recommend looking into along the lines of values or sensibilities as a type of resource held in common? Right, so I love this quote by an advocate in Nebraska. It was a good policy to work on and lobby on because people don't like to say no to the family farm. They definitely don't like to say no to beginning farmers and ranchers because that strikes against everything politically that people say that they want to support. So as a result, LAPIs can be viewed as a bright spot on the political landscape because Republicans and Democrats are able to work together across the aisle. One advocate in Ohio said, we don't usually work with them about somebody who was like on the opposite end of the political spectrum. But we can agree on beginning farmer issues, and it's rare to have a situation with such overwhelming support. So as a result, LAPIs oftentimes pass unanimously, and federal versions are being written right now by some national coalitions and will be proposed this year. Okay. So a couple of summary points about LAPIs. For the most part, they are taking place in the Midwestern states. They are broadly designed to serve broadacre grain farms, and that is who they're serving. Our research is looking at two sets of LAPI approaches. In green states, this one is interesting to follow because the money goes to the landowner as the gatekeeper of land access. Anyway, it's serving grain growers, generational farmers, and the people who enroll in these programs are working 500 acres, but they want to be working 2,000 acres. The owners who enroll own 320 acres, and half of them inherited at least some of their land, and the other half purchased at least some of their land. A different approach is developing on the coasts where they have higher population pressure that's taking land out of farming. And it turns out these LAPIs are serving smaller farms, more diversified, more first-gen farmers. But these farmers as well may be working 100 acres, but they would like to be working 500 acres. So everywhere there's a discordance between farm scale and aspired farm scale. Starting in 2017, advocates within some states began to work to amend their LAPIs to serve more subgroups of farmers beyond beginning farmers. And these efforts began to pass in 2022. So now we have these states saying, okay, with our tool that we've established, we are supporting opportunity in agriculture for beginner farmers and for more groups of farmers. So we're moving from looking at access just in terms of age and beginner status to aiming to address more societal priorities and at redistributing access to agriculture. 2 examples. Oh, yeah. Right, so they're moving to serve a greater diversity of farmers. So far, LAPI designs have mainly served white generational grain farmers. And so the farmers and the landowners who receive the money and the investment and the access are all benefiting from this public investment that we've been making. In the past few years, LAPIs have been including more farmers. So here's 2 examples from Washington and Minnesota. Washington's using the term historically underserved, which is an umbrella term of the US Department of Agriculture to refer to beginner farmers, socially disadvantaged farmers, which means people who are part of ethnic groups that have been subjected to racial or ethnic prejudices, and military veteran farmers. Iowa has also experimented with privileging military veteran farmers. And then in Minnesota, anyone who enrolls still needs to be a beginner farmer. But then any landowner who rents or sells to Minnesota's definition of an emerging farmer, it's more money. And you can see that Minnesota's definition of emerging is broad. At least 5 other states also have recent activity in this space, and there are federal initiatives such as the Justice for Black Farmers Act that are aligned. Oh yeah, and in Minnesota, you just have to say, are you an emerging farmer? Yes or no, this is from their application. So it's interesting to see how these public policy programs are playing out. Okay, so this movement within states parallels a rising national conversation about land ownership as a major basis for accumulating wealth inequalities between groups and Americans and access to participation in agriculture. So as you know, the very basis for who's working what land where in our country is rooted in Europeans pushing to the brink of existence a continent's worth of dynamic foodways that sustained indigenous people for millennia, and that people are keeping alive through great depth of resource and subsistence. Ned Blackhawk provides a comparison in 2 maps showing first, in this one, Native nations in the contiguous contemporary US in about 1500 pre-removal, he calls it, where we see civilizations flowing across the continent. And then this map shows contemporary recognized Native nations and lands. And you can see how where people are is boxed in and discrete. So this is the tremendous loss of land Native or tribal food producers have navigated. And even when we just look at the era we are in now of agricultural land, often laid out according to a grid, where that land is oftentimes raising a single economic or cash crop, the past century has been one of great change in terms of the land, as we saw earlier, and in terms of who's working it along the lines of race and ethnicity. Farms have been closing alongside mechanization, consolidation, loss of jobs, as we talked about. And to illustrate, this transformation is especially well documented for Black farmers. So during the 20th century, we lost 2/3 of farmers, but we lost 98% of Black farmers. According to these data, we gained in Asian, Hispanic, and Indigenous farmers. And part of the conversation is always about imperfections of our best sources of data, as I'm sure is true in your work. In 1920, Black farmers led 14% of US farms, but by 1992, only 1% of farms. And this we know from the work of IU historian Valerie Grimm and others. Black farmers also owned 90% more land in 1910 than today. And a recent estimate from economist Dania Francis and her team at Massachusetts places the value of this dispossession at more than $326 billion, which works out to $1,000 per person in the United States. So wealth at present and assets moving into the future for intergenerational inherited wealth are affected. So not just past harms, but current. There are many people doing amazing work to understand farm workers' pathways to becoming farmers and farm owners. These pathways are not well chronicled by the government, and what does happen takes place within the Department of Labor, not the Department of Agriculture, so that needs to change. By the 1980s, multiple scholars were talking about farming becoming among the whitest of occupations. And the present day fact is that by 2017, over 95% of farmers and farm owners were white, as demonstrated by our collaborator, planner Megan Horst of Portland State, even though only 72% of Americans were white in 2017. So LAPI advocates are responding to these facts when they want to do something to invest in opportunities for farmers. And it's an act of redistribution towards a democracy of full access to opportunity and participation. There is opposition in the courts when more farmer subgroups qualify for LAPIs. To object to LAPIs and related initiatives that prioritize service to farmers of color, politically motivated firms are bringing court cases. These cases name white farmers as complainants. What plays out is a white farmer objects to being discriminated against. Recently, one case objected to Minnesota's work and another in Texas objected to a federal initiative. And both cases were brought by a Pacific Legal Foundation. Through the court cases like these and their coverage, a public understanding develops of white farmers objecting to initiatives to serve farmers of color, enough to stand in the way of them or work to undo them. So we're starting to explore that narrative by asking white farmers how it looks to them, with the goal of continuing to produce research recommendations for policies to support farmers. 3 years ago, as states were gaining momentum in expanding LAPIs to serve more groups of farmers, we were surveying farmers and landowners who had done a LAPI and received either money from their state or land access or both. So we put in a couple questions about expanding LAPIs to serve people beyond beginner farmers. The responses came from about 1,000 people who had done LAPIs. 94% of the respondents said that they were white. The very last two items in the survey asked respondents what would they think of serving beginning farmers, and more groups of farmers through LAPIs. The two groups we asked about were military veteran farmers, and as we put it at the time, historically excluded groups of farmers. We received some pushback from some of our research partners for including these questions. They were afraid that people would object to them such that they would skip the questions or get offended by the survey and not fill it out. But we wanted to ask them. We want to understand the reach of these programs, and also more broadly, we want to hear what farmers think, so we want to ask them. That wound up working out fine, because even though these were the last items in a long instrument that took people 14 minutes to fill out, 88% of respondents did answer them, and only a handful, a smattering, offered anything critical about these questions in the write-in space. So that was a first finding and seemed like a win. And as for how things looked to the respondents, the simple story we have told so far in our briefs for partners is that the majority of white farmers and landowners who have benefited from LAPIs are unopposed to including more groups of farmers beyond beginning farmers and LAPIs. So we combined agree and neutral responses. So 86% would have no opposition to including veterans. 72% would have no opposition to including beginning farmers of color, non-beginning farmers of color. That seemed like another finding that mattered, majority unopposed in theory. We didn't know what those results would look like. Responses to both items were similar in that only a minority of respondents disagree with expanding LAPIs to serve either farmer subgroup. Similarly, about a third of respondents are neutral on both matters. However, differences are there. Twice the respondents disagree that LAPIs should serve non-beginning farmers of color, while most respondents agree with expanding LAPIs to serve non-beginning veterans. Only a third of respondents agree with expanding LAPIs to serve non-beginning farmers of color. The process of scrutinizing these responses sheds more light, and we're conducting analyses now led by our colleague in IU Biostatistics, Ana Macanho. What she's finding is that most respondents provided the same response to both questions. The next group was more favorable towards military veterans, and the third group was more favorable towards historically excluded farmers and ranchers. On both responses, owners were more agreeable than beginning farmers, which is intriguing. On a 5-point scale, beginners' responses, the entire group was about a 0.5 point more agreeable towards veterans. So basically what we see in the numbers is a bit more nuanced than what we get hearing about white farmers suing. We've started to look at these through regression analyses. So far, our models are not capturing much variation on the outcome. We've been putting into the model farm scale, how much land the farmer works, how far they are from how much they'd like to work, their product mixes, and specifically how the extent to which they depend on commodity grain markets. Whether they're from a generational farm family and covariates like education and income levels. We haven't yet explored covariates pertaining to the respondent states or counties, or their political makeup, their level of rurality, or the ethnic or racial diversity of where they live or where their farms are. In other studies, we've incorporated the rural-urban spectrum indicators, rural-urban commuting area and continuum code. And each of those indicators has drawbacks, and each approach is helpful. So I'd be interested in hearing what you might do geographically, spatially, and in terms of diversity and politics of these data. That's how we're beginning to explore the quantitative data. We are also beginning a qualitative phase to hear in their own words from the farmers and landowners who the LAPIs are serving. 200 people agreed to a follow-up interview, and we've begun to pilot interview questions with them. Mainly Marie has called farmers and landowners on the phone and asked them awkward questions about how race looks to them. But people are picking up the phone and they're talking to Marie. So just a couple of highlights from people's responses that illustrate patterns that we're going to look into. Somebody who is neutral had a lot to say. He said, this is a beginning farmer from Iowa. He said, I'm 36 years old and I full well believe that the US government did some sketchy stuff to a lot of people. The ground he owns shouldn't be his, it was taken from people. But if the government were to change that now, it would be repeating the exact same thing that they did then to him. It's also not that for helping military veterans. He feels they have plenty of opportunities already. There's all sorts of assistance for veterans. And he said it's not that he doesn't support programs for Black farmers. The deck is stacked against them, but he doesn't think opening the door in the LAPI program is going to help them be successful. Somebody who agreed with expanding them said, you know, it's really hard to get started in this business anyway, and any help that people could receive would really help them get a leg up and help people get started who aren't a farm kid. This is what we're hearing in interviews repeated, is that people see the need to support people who are not generational inheritors. And also people see the need to push back against corporate entry and overtake of agriculture. So we're just beginning to play around with these questions in interviews and plan next to explore some questions that we got from the book The Sum of Us by Heather McGee that Valerie Grimm recommended, which looks at a zero-sum mindset that prevails in the country and alternatives to it. And we also want to probe with people into diversity that's in their own communities, knowing that rural places are getting more and more diverse, with meat packers as employers, recruiting people from overseas. Well, not so much overseas as Central America, Mexico, and the Caribbean. But we'll see. Anyway, so just flesh out from white farmers who are in these rural spaces benefiting from public initiatives, what it would look like to them for those to diversify more, and what they see as starting and surviving in farming, how that looks to farmers who have received public investment and who they'd like to see us invest in next. Okay, let's go for questions.
Let's start off with any grad or undergrad students that would like to kick off the question session, and then we can move into others as well. Okay, how about other questions? Oh, I have a question.
Thank you, Julia, for your presentation. This is super important and relevant research, and thank you for everything you do. I've been following your work for a while now, and this is super important. Thank you. I think many of the things that you shared with us today, we can speak about them globally, and that is super interesting. Especially this financiarization of land, when we think of all the work of Stefan Uma and others thinking about land grabs in terms of this rentier capitalism and the speculation that we see with land. So I think that is fantastic. I wanted to ask you two questions. One, if you would say that maybe there's a fourth challenge, that is that, and we have discussed this in this room before, that most of what is produced is not actually food, but it is fuel and feed. If you maybe found something in your research on that relation. The other question I was curious about, and I just want to pick your brain, the idea, borrow your brain to think with about pesticides. If you found the pesticide question, you mentioned a little bit about younger farmers maybe bringing innovations, and I was curious if that is part of your.
Thank you so much for the questions, Diana. Let's see. There are loads of challenges. I just capped it at 3. We could just continue forming a list in this room right now. Fuel and feed, absolutely. And we were really excited to see, we were hopeful that would play out in our regression models. In some other work that I didn't speak to today, we're looking at the extent to which a land access challenge persists for people even after they enroll and benefit from LAPIs. They have the investment of the state that's helping them rent or purchase hundreds of acres. They're working a lot of land, but almost everybody wants more land because they want to grow commodity grains, almost always commodity feed grains. And to make that pencil out, you need a ton of land. And it's a disservice to the economic model is a disservice to the number of people who want to farm. And so we are hopeful that our work can speak to the need to really invest in helping farms diversify their products away from feed grains, fuel crops that go to become ethanol. Because this just looks like too fragile of a foundation that many people are continuing to pursue. a lot of people really do want to be farmers, and a lot of them want to be big grain farmers. So at the moment, we're a little disappointed in our regression models because we have these 1,000 responses, and there turns out to be just like not that much variability across them. And we're not showing that people who are diversifying away from just depending on raising fuel and feed crops are doing better in terms of their land access or their success. We were hopeful to be able to show something like that, but we're not there right now. Yeah, but certainly it's a rickety foundation and it needs to be turned on its head through much more investment from the state, which Eduardo did a beautiful job of talking about in our paper that I mentioned. Pesticides, we have not looked in this project at farm management, you know, how people are working the fields. We're looking at a different level. And so this is something that we haven't looked at yet, although people are bringing it up in the follow-up interviews that we've done, you know, like opportunities to support more young farmers, beginning farmers in cover cropping or doing alternatives to pesticides or management techniques that reduce the reliance on pesticides. So people will bring it up, but we're not asking about it in this project.
It's interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah.
Please. Hi. Thank you so much for the presentation. So, my knowledge about agriculture in US is not great, but I was just wondering, like, while LAPI is working to some extent, but without the presence of a federal or state law prohibiting non-farmers to own land, how effective would that be? Because, like, I think Bill Gates is the biggest farmer on paper in US. And then there are other loopholes like, I think in California, the biggest farmer is like an Indian origin guy whose main crop is almonds and not like other food crops, not a diversified food production. So how does, in the absence of federal or state law prohibiting non-farmers or like monocropping farmers is going to prevent small farmers, especially and also in food diversity?
Yeah, so you're saying there are these laws we could have that we do not have. And there are also these incentives. You know, in many places, incentives for non-farmers to buy land, for corporate bidders to bid on land and purchase land. Oftentimes they're offered lower tax rates than farmers, and tax rates on agricultural land are already very low. I would like to see those go up. And so, yeah, what would that look like to have a law prohibiting non-farmers from owning land? I think that's a great question, and perhaps others in the room want to speak to it.
Yeah, I do want to speak to it. It would be, it would have 100% opposition from farmers.
Yeah.
100%. Because it would reduce substantially the value of their farmland on the open market. The last thing farmers love getting the subsidies. What they don't want are restrictions on how they can use their land. They don't want to be tied in. Now, you can offer them all kinds of deals to make them want to do the right thing in terms of conservation easements, low inheritance taxes to keep land in the family. These kinds of programs that, you know, they're actually subsidies to landowners who prefer beginning farmers. So it creates a win-win between those two groups. But of course, and this goes back to your question about this culture, they all have the same minds, this all agreement about what should be going on. Well, that's the way interest groups are. Farmers are the most powerful interest group in the country historically. They're far more subsidized than any other industries except maybe mining in the country. So they're a small group, right? 1 to 3% of GDP, right? But they're very powerful politically, and they use that. And so why are we thinking about subsidies to help beginner farmers and not subsidies to help beginner entrepreneurs or people getting into other industries? And the answer is farming's the favorite.
It was how to propose tables.
Yeah.
Who that,
Yeah,
why not?
yeah, well, exactly, and they're going to do that. So I think we need to be cognizant of what's going on as a matter of political economy, the rent seeking and all of that, as well as the political viability of things like this. I mean, I served on a farmland preservation task force a long time ago. And it was just very stunning the way that the farmers are able to move things around to subsidy and away from any kind of restriction on their property rights.
We have 2 questions on the line. I think, Scott, do you mind?
No, not at all. So Professor Edesina is asking, in what ways is this policy preventing loss of farmlands to other forms of development? And if it's okay, he has another one as well. Sure they do. What is the level of organic farm cropping systems vis-a-vis new entrants into the farming business? And everyone's saying what a thoughtful and wonderful presentation, so well done.
Okay, well, loss of farmlands to other forms of development. So land going out of agriculture and becoming oftentimes a neighborhood or a strip mall or urban development. This is loss of farmland, conversion of farmland. Some of the LAPIs we're researching take this on directly because they give beginning farmers a 0% loan that's sizable to not only buy a farm, but then to protect that farmland for agriculture forever by placing a conservation easement on it. So some states that have quickly rising populations, mainly on the coasts, are working directly on loss of farmland. And over the years, they've managed to protect like 1/4 of all their farmland in states like Maryland, right outside of DC. I would say the other LAPIs we're looking at serve to, well, I was gonna say they serve to indirectly prevent loss of farmland because they're making beginning farmers more competitive in the market by making landowners more inclined, giving them an incentive to rent or sell to them. But I think it probably doesn't amount to much because the amounts of money that we're talking about to bid on or to rent or purchase agricultural land are quite a bit lower than the amounts of money people are talking about to purchase land for development. So for agricultural land, say people are bidding 10,000 an acre for a nice round number. Whereas for development, people are paying 60,000 an acre, 100,000 an acre. And so it's apples and oranges. And so in response to the professor's question, I would say one of the approaches is taking on farmland loss and the other is doing nothing about it. As far as organic cropping systems and beginning farmers, that also makes me think of like a 2-tiered response because you have diversified food farms that may be practicing organic methods and may be pursuing organic certification, a smaller scale farm. Did not see it happening among our respondents who are broad acre grain farms. Very few are transitioning to organic, which I was disappointed to see because organic is a way that people can earn more money on less land. At least it's been pitched as that. Maybe people are finding something different on grain farms.
Alfonso online has his hand up. Alfonso?
Oh, man.
Oh, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. Two things crossed my mind. I just sent a little notice about the Indiana new legislation that was passed that opened up a what they call the agricultural online portal for on public policy on agricultural matters. But that I read somewhere and learned some time ago that Black farmers who have or maybe their family were intergenerational farmers or they've moved to the inner cities and places are interested now in continuing their farming, but they do it in the inner cities. And I was wondering whether you had any comments regarding that, or did you run anything regarding your studies and your research regarding policy concerning farming in the cities. The other thing is that some years ago, I learned that Indiana farmers were interested in engaging in a variety of commodities to produce, but among those things was the production of possibility of marijuana because they were expecting the legislature to pass such legislation that would allow them to grow certain kinds of marijuana. I wonder if you went across anything about that in your research as well, and what has developed in terms of Indiana policy, if you know of anything.
Mr. Mans, thank you so much for your questions. I'm honored to see you here. I remember you because you were my softball coach in 8th grade.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
That
I
was
said I didn't remember you.
Well, I changed my last name since then, but
Uh-huh.
your daughter Sean was around my age.
Right,
And
right.
that was a fun team.
Uh-huh. I must tell her that when I see her.
Oh, that's great.
Okay, as for Black farmers in the city, since the tools we have been researching are relevant and applicable to broader, larger acreage farms, because the more land you have, the more money you get, and it makes it more worthwhile to jump through all the hoops. For small parcels of land, these programs are oftentimes not relevant, although there are exceptions to that. So we've been mainly learning from rural farms. However, our colleague Shelley Suttles of the O'Neill School is leading a case study as part of our project, learning from urban and suburban growers in the Minnesota Twin Cities and asking them, what are your land access policy incentive needs? You know, to what extent are the tools that we have serving urban and suburban growers in our country? And what sorts of other tools do they need that we don't have? So Shelley's been doing a lovely inquiry with farmers and farm advocates up in the Twin Cities, and she'll be coming out with her results this year. As far as Indiana farmers and marijuana, folks in the room may want to chime in. Our colleague Justin Ross at the O'Neill School went down a rabbit hole looking into the effects of the rise of marijuana farming on these land access dynamics, and concluded that it's also apples and oranges because they're oftentimes indoors, undercover, on small plots. And so it's a different approach to farming. Hemp is a whole nother story that I'm not super up to date on that somebody may want to speak to on hemp. Would anybody like to say anything about marijuana farming in Indiana, the latest? Would like to learn if someone knows.
Well, thank you.
Welcome. Thank you.
Tasha and Gustavo?
I think Natasha was first.
Yeah, thank you for a great presentation. I have two kind of formulated questions. The first has to do with zoning as a way to mitigate the consequences of land transfer irreparably, I guess. Why that isn't, it doesn't sound like it's being instituted as much if land transfer is so possible for farmers. And then the second one has to do with land and its actual value being access to water resources and the way that over extraction, especially of aquifers, is causing concentration into the hands of big farmers that can actually afford it. And so I was wondering if there was anything that was being done to combat that.
Yeah, so would you say a little bit more about zoning?
So this is why this is a very partially formulated question. It seems like zoning requirements for agricultural land, from what I understand, would have to be petitioned to be changed if they wanted to do like, turn it into a strip mall, right? Is that, maybe this is a state by state thing. This is very, very anecdotal at this point now, but my grandfather has a farm, and there is a new university that has been established very close to it. And no one in my family wants the farm. And so we're looking at what happens when it's time to transfer the farm. And there's quite a lot of hoops to go through if it were to be transferred out of our hands into a business rather than staying in agriculture. And so it seems like, from my limited knowledge about it, these zoning restrictions could be really useful in preserving farms as farms.
Yeah, oh, that's a fascinating story. I'm glad you got around to that. Where is the farm?
In Missouri.
Oh, go Missouri. Dang.
I don't know if it's like county, I don't know how zones work, basically.
My understanding is that they operate at the county level.
Okay.
Some counties have no zoning rules. Like, I think my understanding is the more rural the county, the less zoning there is. And and so it's a real space for innovation. And so some counties really are innovating in terms of protecting their farmland and saying what can go where. There's a lot of resistance and pushback and outcry to all the rules, as Dan was just referencing, basically. And then I'm sure some of you have experienced. But that's a neat example that there are going to be costs incurred if your grandpa's farm moves from being a farm to being a college or business.
I actually don't know if it's cost inferred, but it's at least some kind of legal process to get it changed. That seems like it could be used to restrict it.
Yeah, I mean, zoning is a definite part of the puzzle and could have been one of the opening challenges if I knew more about it, because it's there and it matters and it makes a big difference what they're doing or not doing in zoning. Water resources. We actually just came up in a meeting we convened last week with advisors from Western states. They have not come up much yet in our research because, as you can see from the states we've been focusing on so far, they're in pretty mesic places, with the exception of like Western Nebraska. We haven't really encountered water as a problem. These states whose policies we've been studying generally have plentiful rainfall. However, our study that we're conducting now, and it's just getting off the ground, and that USDA is going to shut down any day because of the EI component, is focused on plains and western states. And the water resources in the aquifers are a huge factor, because then when the water gets depleted and people lose their water rights, then there's much less that can be done agriculturally on the land, which is too bad. But also, is that an ultimate outcome of trying to farm irrigated potatoes in Colorado? I don't know, like, whether to shed a tear about this. I think I want to shed a tear about this, but also it's hard for the landowner and it's hard on the entering farmer's prospects when people want irrigated land. And now there's no more water in the aquifers to irrigate. And so it's a dimension that we're just beginning to get acquainted with because of the shifting geographic focus of the work. And if anybody else would like to speak to that, I'd be interested to hear what you might say.
Well, Minnesota,
Yeah.
which has a lot less rainfall than people think it does. Irrigation is huge in Minnesota. And it's one of the reasons it's huge is that the growing significant crop is potatoes, which take a lot of water. Potato farmers from Idaho have moved to Minnesota in the last 20, 25 years. So huge tracts of land are being bought by commercial potato growers and huge irrigation systems going in, which then affects everyone around it. And There's one company up there, their major sales of their potatoes is to McDonald's. They have one plant in the county next to our county. All they do is make French fries for McDonald's. So you know they're growing a lot of potatoes. It's a big, irrigation's a big deal. And it's one of the states you're studying, so you got to keep track of that.
It's true.
So we have Gustavo, and then we have a question online, and then Brian, then Mike, then Dan. Thank you. Yeah, so Gustavo, we're in the quick version now.
So I have one comment and then one question. So I'm seeing here from San Luis, Fred data set. So if you combine agriculture, forestry, fishing, and hunting, that is around 1% of the GDP. So why do we encourage our youth to go into only 1% of the GDP? So why don't, if I see good reasons to have general policies to encourage young people to enter new businesses, but why they should be considering only 1% of the GDP? Why not any sector? And we let them choose which is the right sector in which there are more options for them. So maybe I'm wrong, but if I'm wrong, I think it's good for this project to start saying why we need more people entering in this sector as opposed to other sectors, which maybe there is, I'm complete ignorance on this sector in particular. So maybe there is a reason. So you don't want to depopulate rural areas, or you don't want to have these ghost towns in rural areas. But I would put that as kind of at the beginning of the project, because that gives, especially for non-specialists, some kind of, perspective on where you are going. And my question is, I think you show us at the beginning of the presentation a time path of farms. Do you mind going back just for 1 second? So, because maybe I got wrong that picture.
The number of farms?
Yeah, number of farms, and then there were kind of 3, that one. So what I'm reading there is like something happened. Maybe I cannot read exactly the dates, but I don't know, in the 70s or 80s, and then everything plateaued, no? So do you have any idea of what happened with those plateaus, or why? So it's like there is a huge drop in the number of farms, huge increase in the acres per farm, but then a plateau on both things. So what explains the change in that period, and why the plateau? Again, maybe something well established, and it's just my complete ignorance on this area, but looks something interesting, because it's not like a trends that continue, but it's something that happened in a number of decades, and then plateau for again, I'm reading right. So we are talking about the end of the 70s, and then from the 70s until right now, it's pretty flat. Okay, yeah.
Yeah. Well, first off, to your challenge to stay at the top, like, here's why we need to help people enter agriculture. I really appreciate that. And I've been meaning to add something like that, because I've been thinking, like, why do we? Why is it a problem? Why is it a problem to just have like AI farming? Everywhere, no people. So thank you for flagging that. And I would say that I would agree that we don't want to encourage our youth to enter into the standard existing agriculture that we have now. I mean, to Deanna's point, and to our paper with Eduardo, what we want is to see agriculture diversify and to add value close to home and become much more rich in terms of what's taking place on the farms and the ecosystem and in the work. So we're trying to envision that and move towards it, rather than enter into kind of a lonesome profession where you're in a machine raising corn for ethanol and making pennies, except for you're making enough to buy nice trucks at the end of the year. Okay, so as for the plateau, I think that this was such a dynamic time in terms of technological developments and policies to support the scale of agriculture and growing. That after the World War II period classically marks a period of great technological change and structural change in agriculture. And then as far as why it plateaued out here, I don't know. What would other people say?
There's only so much you can do with one tractor, I think.
Well, I mean, it's like, it looks like.
Then you need 2 tractors or 3 and 4, and I think, that's the plateau.
My point is, the problem that you are focusing on, it seems to be not aggravating over time. It has been, kind of stable for 50 years, no? Or, 40 years.
I think part of it may be, like, so you get the GI Bill.
So it's policy.
People are going to college. You've got a general shift in population from rural areas to urban areas. So it's got to be a very complicated explanation. But then after the 1970s stagnation, right, in the 70s, the oil crisis and whatever else is going on, and things stabilize. We start getting CAFOs and all kinds of new agricultural technologies, good, bad, and otherwise.
And then the farmers that started in 1974 are now 65 years old,
Right,
and they're ready to get out, and we don't have enough people coming in. But I mean, that 65 to 72-year-old, range
But
is.
that's always been there, right? That
Yeah, but it's just becoming more proportionate in that realm.
So you're expecting this to become kind of a worse problem in the future?
It seems like it's becoming from the literature, what the USDA-ARS puts out, that age, sort of the aging population is becoming more profound, because a few years ago, it was 59 was the average age of American farmer. Now it's, obviously, but I know we have more questions.
So, this is all great.
I appreciate you all pitching in, because I've been talking a lot and that's not my normal mode. So thank you for generating a conversation. Okay.
No, not at all. So Liz Brownlee was asking, thanks of course for the great presentation. I'm curious if any of your research has looked at farm viability related to lappies, meaning are beginning farmers who have utilized lappies more likely to be able to make a living farming?
Thanks for your question, Liz, and thanks for being here. We are in the process of trying to look at that in some work I didn't speak to today. About 2/3 of beginning farmers who have done lappies say that the lappies help their farms to succeed. And we're looking into why that is. And what happened with the 1/3 who say like, yeah, I signed up for this thing and got the stuff, and then it didn't really help me. So we're interested in sussing out that difference. We did find that, among the respondents to our survey, like high 90% of them are still farming. Which is interesting because we know that about 1/3 of farms close every year, at least among beginning farms. So to have almost everybody still farming, I mean, of course, that's a bias in terms of who filled the thing out versus who didn't. But those are a couple of ways in which we're looking into viability, Liz. And we're trying to connect that to people's product mixes and scales and their relationships that they have in the family and in the neighborhood, and see if we can identify any patterns along those lines. Thank you.
I know, Brian, you were very patient and I see your hand has now gone down. Let me just give you the opportunity though, before we turn to Mike.
I'll leave it over to Mike unless there's time at the end. Thanks.
Okay. Sorry again about that, Brian. Mike.
Hi, thanks, Julia. It's been a very interesting talk, and the point about Liz is one of the things I was going to ask about is how well this is working, and it sounds like it's working pretty well on an individual basis. But I got a couple of questions about this as a sort of a policy issue. I grew up in one of your green states there in Ohio and in a farmland, and I was always struck by how active farm cooperatives were. And I wonder if any of these individuals that are applying for this program have had any connections to the cooperatives in that area before they apply, whether the cooperatives as organizations have been trying to recruit people to sign up for this program, or whether they're just there, or whether the state officials just see these as, you know, individual relationships, and are they trying to cluster the programs that they're supporting and stuff like that, sort of like they would in some of the small businesses, getting sort of a, you know, entrepreneurial cluster or something. So is this a purely a one-on-one government to individual recipient, or are there some intermediate organizations with cooperatives and any efforts to cluster these at all?
Oh, I love that question. Thank you so much. It makes me realize how little we've heard people mention cooperatives.
Okay.
And what we are seeing is that these programs are serving as a marketing tool for the beginning farmer, because they know they qualify as a beginning farmer with the state. And then they take that to landowners and say, look, if you sell or rent, you're going to get this credit from the state. And so that's how it's really functioning, is in providing young and beginning farmers with a bargaining chip. But it would be really interesting to look into cooperatives. Are you thinking of particular types of cooperatives?
No, I don't have a specific on that, but it just struck me as the kind of thing that cooperatives might be interested in encouraging this. They might be interested in not encouraging this because they're already involved in plenty of farm connections. You know, it's sort of a group already established. So I could sort of see their attitude going either way. I guess it's also kind of a sense of whether this is being thought of in a similar way to some of the earlier questions, whereas that this is sort of an alternative to you know, just regular support for entrepreneurial startups and the kinds of ways that would be approached. It sounds like that logic, that policy logic, is not really being applied here. It's much more a commercial transaction. And your emphasis here on they go to the landowner and say that we have this potential support here, that makes it more look like a pure transactional sort of thing, and not really more of a long-term developmental thing. So.
Yeah, I would just say a couple of things in response. Justin Ross over at O'Neill has, you know, submitted a manuscript about his research on LAPIs, where, you know, he frames them as a quite unusual business startup tool, and that it's an indirect incentive to the startup. One reason I wonder, we know that part of the reason it took almost 20 years for states to begin to succeed in passing LAPIs is that there was some pushback or resistance from established farmers who feared they would be outcompeted. Right. So I wonder if something there affects the ways co-ops are engaging or not with the initiatives. Okay.
Cool. Okay. Something to look into in the future, maybe.
Yeah, thank you.
We are at the lightning round portion. So Brian, I saw you come back on if you'd like to offer yours, and then if anybody has some final ones, we can move to the chat as well. Brian, please.
Yeah, just quickly, you talked about redirecting subsidies, and at the beginning, I think you were talking about the issue that subsidies often just tend to push up land prices, and that you can look at that in terms of agricultural economics and so on. But thinking more, and I'm in Maryland, though I just see newspaper stories, which has tried to do some things different in terms of the kind of policy tools that would be available for doing a difference. And in the current context, whether you have anything to say if some of the language about underserved and DEI and so on is being forbidden, are there other ways to approach those kind of issues of framing, supporting alternatives for agriculture besides commodity grain crops, including getting away from all the issues of the subsidies and perverse subsidies that are built into that? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, we know that historically there were some state advocacy coalitions who turned to proposing a LAPI after they had tried to resist the subsidy structure and gotten nowhere, because they saw that supporting farms and getting bigger and small and medium farms going away. What we hear from our research partners who are really in the policy advocacy space is that it's time for, an Office of Food, a Department of Food, and a Department of Small Farms or small and medium farms as alternative ways to approach, like, okay, how can we incentivize diversification on farms that are selling into local and regional markets and really support these things, and support farms according to scale, which some of the LAPIs are trying to do in their own way, by looking at the net worth of the farmers who they allow to qualify. But I really appreciate your question right now about alternative approaches to structuring these policy tools. I think there's also a lot of potential in what we were talking about earlier about taxation and zoning and laws and these other levels of opportunity to address this like knot of problems. Does that sound like what you were asking, Brian?
Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay.
Dan?
Yeah, we seem to have there's statistics that seem to show that we're losing family farming, and then there are statistics that make me wonder. So according to the 2022 agricultural census, 89% of all farms are small family farms nationwide. Should it be higher? Should it be lower? I mean, the evidence is also clear that in terms of economies of scale, large scale family farms are a lot more productive than small scale family farms. So I'm just repeating statistics from the census. Okay. So small scale family farms, farms with a gross cash farm income below $350,000, operated 27% of agricultural land, responsible for 46% of the total value of production. Okay. I'm sorry, that's the large scale family farm. 27% of agricultural land, 46% of production. Small family farms, $350,000 below, have, let's see, 45% of agricultural land, 18% of the total value of production. And then you have a medium-sized family farms. Only 2% of farms are in the United States are classified as non-family, corporate non-family farms.
Yeah.
So what's going on?
Julia, do you wanna maybe respond, and then Deanna as well? And we have a few minutes left, but yeah, do you have any quick response? And then I know it's a bigger debate.
Our Department of Agriculture's definition of small family farm is huge. It has a high
$150,000
gross income.
cash income.
Also, it ties to the Census of Agriculture methodology, which collects data from everybody who submits a Schedule F. And so you have a lot of data from farms that don't even sell or produce. And so the analyses I've been really coming to respect from our Department of Agriculture are those who siphon out everybody who's earning $10,000 or less on their farm and just looks at those who are above it. And then that gives you a different depiction of what's taking place in commercial agriculture.
So the 10,000 or less would be considered non-commercial agriculture.
Is that the cutoff?
I mean, I don't know. You suggested
different sense of the scale and the stakes, it sounds like. Deanna, please.
No, the other important point is that they don't produce food. So yes, productivity in terms of feed and fuel, but if you also take into account soil deterioration, water contamination.
Presumption is they follow economic incentives.
Yes,
right.
What I'm saying
like all
is
other
that it's not
businesses
enough.
do.
It's not enough to understand the problem that we have in the room and we have been discussing.
Yeah, but the focus is food security. Interesting. So Liz as well, I know that you have your hand up, but we're also pretty much out of time. Liz, did you have one thing you wanted to weigh in on that? How about we have some follow-up conversations as we conclude, if that's okay? But for now, Julia, thank you so much for this excellent presentation. Really terrific.
On Wednesday, we have a special lecture, 3 to 4:30, Alejandro Camargo, geographer of water from Colombia. If you're able to join us, please come. This lecture will be on sediments.
Yeah. And 3.
Friday at noon, we have LS talking about
Are you on campus? Farmers.
how to make it less relevant.
Okay.
And if you've ever heard or
It's always political, on subsidies.
about actually.
Yeah, but those.
Leon,
Yeah,
It's like, so
that's what you want. Let's not go around. Give me a subsidy, that thing.
Memorial.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's the great all about, it's like.
Farms.
Just went up.
Subsidy for smaller farms.
You go in with a big one and you go.
Guys, age 35,
I felt like it was really good.